In the heart of a dry Spanish plain, archaeologists unearthed something that would haunt them forever. Scattered human remains, shattered skulls, and bones marked by violent blows. These weren't simple burials, they were echoes of unspeakable horrors. For centuries, we imagined prehistoric life as simple: hunt, gather, survive. But these bones whispered a darker story, of brutal murders, massacres, and deaths so horrific they were etched into the fossil record. This episode dives into the worst prehistoric deaths ever uncovered. These are not legends, but cold evidence, found buried beneath the earth. Evidence that reveals how dangerous, violent, and terrifying early human life could be. Today, we'll piece together these forgotten stories and explore the chilling truths behind them. Prehistoric death wasn't just about survival. It was about suffering, cruelty, and sometimes unimaginable pain. Tens of thousands of years ago, the Earth was not the planet we know today. Picture Europe during the late Pleistocene, icy winds sweeping across vast tundras, megafauna like mammoths and saber-toothed cats roaming the land, and small bands of Homo sapiens struggling to survive. The world was colder, wilder, and far more dangerous. And not just because of animals or weather, but because of each other. Let's travel to what is now Austria, to a site known as Kremswachtberg. In 2005, archaeologists uncovered a grave that at first glance seemed peaceful. Two infant skeletons lay side by side, carefully buried under mammoth shoulder blades, decorated with ochre and ivory beads. But upon closer inspection, a mystery emerged. One of the skulls showed a suspicious indentation. Researchers debated, was it an accident or was it murder? In the same region, scientists discovered a young woman's skeleton, missing its head entirely. No animal marks, no signs of scavenging, just a clean, deliberate removal. This wasn't an isolated case. Across Europe, from the Czech Republic to France, multiple Paleolithic burials show signs of trauma. Skulls with crushed craniums, broken ribs that had healed unevenly, stone tools embedded in bone. These weren't the remains of people who died from disease or cold. They died by violence, human-inflicted. And then there's the site of Jebel Sahaba, along the Nile Valley in what is now Sudan. Discovered in the 1960s, this 13,000-year-old cemetery is one of the oldest known mass graves in human history. 61 individuals were buried here, men, women, and children. Over 40% of them showed signs of violent trauma. Arrowheads lodged in bones, skull fractures, defensive wounds on forearms. Some were attacked multiple times. One man had a blade, tip still embedded in his pelvis. This wasn't just interpersonal violence, it was warfare, organized, repeated, and deadly. It shocked researchers because it rewrote what we thought we knew about early human societies. These people weren't just surviving the environment, they were surviving each other. The Jebel Sahaba massacre suggests that even before cities or kings, before empires or written language, humans were capable of coordinated killing. And perhaps more chillingly, that death by violence was not rare, it was expected. But why? Why would small groups of hunter-gatherers turn on each other with such brutality? Part of the answer lies in the environment. As the Ice Age came to a close, rapid climate changes disrupted ecosystems. Resources like water and game became scarce. Rivers dried, animal herds shifted their migration paths. Survival required constant movement, and competition grew fierce. Tribes fought over riverbanks, hunting territories, and foraging grounds. And in this unforgiving world, mercy was often a luxury no one could afford. Even more disturbing is the evidence that some of these deaths weren't the result of quick, clean attacks, but slow, torturous ends. In Gough's Cave, England, archaeologists found human bones with cut marks, but not just anywhere. These marks were concentrated around joints and soft tissue, areas where a skilled butcher would begin their work. Even more chilling, skulls had been carefully modified into cups. Yes, drinking vessels made from human heads. Cannibalism, not just for survival, but possibly ritualistic. The people of Gough's Cave lived around 15,000 years ago, during a time of extreme cold. It's possible they resorted to cannibalism to survive, but the precision and care of the modifications suggest something more than desperation. It hints at ritual, a symbolic act, perhaps honoring the dead or conquering them completely. What emerges from all of this is a grim reality. Prehistoric life was deeply violent, but not randomly so. These acts were shaped by their time, by hunger, by climate, by conflict. These were not mindless killings, but acts rooted in strategy, belief, and fear. We tend to romanticize our ancestors, imagine them as noble savages living in harmony with nature. But the fossil record tells a different story. Our ancestors felt rage. They knew vengeance. They understood cruelty. And when we look at the fractured bones, the embedded arrows, and the modified skulls, we're forced to confront a haunting truth. The capacity for horror has always been part of what makes us human. In 1983, near the quiet German village of Talheim, a construction crew stumbled upon a pit. What lay inside would become one of the most chilling archaeological finds in Europe, a prehistoric crime scene frozen in time. Inside the pit were 34 skeletons, men, women, and children, all deposited in a haphazard heap. But this wasn't a burial, this was a massacre. Dating back nearly 7,000 years, the Talheim death pit belongs to the early Neolithic period, when agriculture was just beginning to reshape human societies. For the first time, people were settling in one place, building villages, planting crops. But with land came ownership, and with ownership came conflict. Every single skeleton in that pit told a story of violence. Most had fatal blows to the skull, likely from stone axes or clubs. Some were struck from behind, others from the front. A few had both arms raised in what could only be interpreted as a final, desperate attempt to defend themselves. What shocked scientists most was the pattern. The victims were mostly adult men and children, along with a few women. But crucially, many adult women were missing. The prevailing theory: this was a targeted raid, one group attacking another, killing the men and children and abducting the women. A prehistoric form of warfare and forced assimilation. And this wasn't an isolated case. Similar mass graves have been found in Austria, Poland, and France, all dating to the same era. Each tells the same story. Settlements attacked, entire families wiped out, some bodies mutilated. In Aspern-Schletz, Austria, another pit revealed at least 67 individuals, some with limbs twisted or broken, possibly post-mortem, suggesting either ritual desecration or sheer cruelty. This wasn't just violence. It was systematic, organized, and brutal. This period marks a turning point in human history. As societies shifted from nomadic bands to farming communities, the nature of violence changed. No longer spontaneous or reactionary, violence became strategic. It was about territory, resources, and dominance. Farming created surplus, and surplus created something worth stealing. It's easy to overlook how revolutionary and dangerous the birth of agriculture was. Before, humans could move if the land was barren. Now they were tied to fields, villages, and livestock. Losing that meant starvation. So when rival groups encroached, the response wasn't negotiation. It was annihilation. And perhaps most tragic of all, these weren't faceless enemies. Genetic studies from Talheim suggest the attackers and victims may have shared ancestry. These could have been neighboring tribes, perhaps even distant relatives. But in a world where every harvest mattered, kinship was a fragile bond. Let's go further back in time to the case of the Shanidar Neanderthals in Iraq. In the Shanidar cave, archaeologists uncovered several Neanderthal skeletons. One of them, known as Shanidar III, had a deep puncture wound in his rib. CT scans revealed that the wound was caused by a projectile, likely a wooden spear. The angle of the injury suggested it wasn't self-inflicted or accidental. He had been struck by someone else, and the force implied it came from a thrown weapon, not one used in close combat. The most remarkable part? Neanderthals weren't supposed to throw weapons, but Homo sapiens could. This has led some researchers to speculate, was Shanidar III killed by a modern human? Was this one of the earliest acts of interspecies violence? If so, it paints an even bleaker picture. Not only were Homo sapiens violent toward each other, they may have played a direct role in the extinction of other hominins. Imagine the scene. A band of Neanderthals encounters a group of sapiens at a river or a hunting trail. Tensions rise, weapons are drawn, a spear flies, blood spills, and another piece of the Neanderthal story comes to an end. This isn't just a theory. In France, cut marks on Neanderthal bones match those found on hunted animals, suggesting they were not only killed but possibly butchered. Did humans eat Neanderthals? The evidence is still debated, but it's clear that prehistoric death was often a result of one species or tribe asserting dominance over another. And in each of these deaths, there's more than just violence. There's a pattern, a logic. The Talheim pit, the Shanidar wound, the desecrated corpses in Aspan. None of them were random. These were acts of control, revenge, and conquest. What becomes clear is that the worst prehistoric deaths weren't caused by nature. They were caused by people. People who looked, thought, and felt much like us. Their reasons, jealousy, survival, power haven't changed. What has changed is the way we bury the evidence. High in the Ötztal Alps, where the modern borders of Austria and Italy meet, the ice preserved a man for over 5,000 years. In 1991, two hikers stumbled upon what they thought was a frozen mountaineer. But this was no modern casualty. This was Ötzi, the Iceman. And his death would become one of the most scrutinized prehistoric cold cases in history. At first, it was assumed Ötzi had died of exposure. After all, he was found lying face down in a melting glacier, surrounded by his tools and clothing. But modern forensics revealed a far more sinister tale. CT scans uncovered a flint arrowhead, lodged in his left shoulder, severing a major artery. He bled out in minutes. Further analysis showed defensive wounds on his hands, a blow to the back of his head, and bruises that suggested he had been in a fight shortly before he died. Ötzi was murdered. The story that emerges from his remains tells not one of a peaceful hunter dying in the elements, but of a man running from something. Perhaps he was ambushed, perhaps betrayed. He carried a copper axe, an incredibly valuable item for his time, yet no one took it. Was it a message, a warning? His stomach contents revealed his last meal: meat, einkorn wheat, and moss. Moss not native to the area, suggesting he had traveled far and fast in his final hours. Wounded, weary, and hunted, Ötzi climbed into the mountains. Maybe he hoped the altitude would offer safety. Instead, he collapsed, and the glacier preserved his final painful moment for 5 millennia. But Ötzi wasn't alone in suffering. This fate. In the Russian steppe, another discovery chilled archaeologists to the core. In a burial mound in the North Caucasus, the remains of multiple individuals, including children, were found with severe injuries. One skeleton, a young, adult male, had his face bashed in with such force that his skull was shattered inwards. Another had been struck with a bladed weapon across the ribs, slicing through bone. These burials dated back to around 3000 BCE, during the Bronze Age, when metal weapons began to tip the scale of human conflict. No longer limited to stone clubs and arrows, warriors now wielded swords and daggers forged in fire. And the consequences were brutal. As metallurgy advanced, so did warfare. Organized armies began to form. Nomadic tribes, like the Yamnaya of the steppes, became terrifyingly efficient. Tall, strong, mounted on horses and armed with bronze weapons, they swept across Europe and Asia in waves of conquest. Archaeogenetic studies show their genetic imprint spread rapidly, at times replacing nearly 90% of local male lineages. What does that mean in human terms? It means mass killings. The systematic elimination of rival males. Women and children assimilated, while the men were simply erased. These weren't isolated raids. This was prehistoric genocide, and there's physical proof. In the Lechtal Valley in Germany, researchers uncovered a farming community where nearly every adult male had been killed around the same time. Genetic testing showed that the survivors, all women and children, carried the DNA of the incoming Yamnaya, but none of the original male farmers. This wasn't peaceful integration. It was violent domination. And yet, even beyond the battlefield, death came in other terrifying forms. At the Herxheim site in Germany, More than 1,000 human bones were found, bones from different regions brought together to a single location around 5000 BCE. The bones bore cut marks, breakage patterns, and signs of having been boiled. Some skulls had been broken to extract the brain. The victims, mostly adults but also children, showed no consistent demographics, except that they were outsiders. This was not war. This was ritual cannibalism. The people of Herxheim may have believed that consuming their enemies, or strangers, gave them power, or perhaps it was an act of spiritual purification, a way to honor or destroy, we don't know. But the repeated nature of the practice over generations suggests that it was intentional, systematic, and widely accepted within that culture. It's easy to imagine prehistoric death as sudden and random, a fall, a predator, a storm. But the reality is far darker. Our ancestors not only killed each other, they developed cultures around how to do it. Some deaths were brutal and fast. Others were slow, calculated, and ritualized. And as tools evolved, so did the creativity. Of cruelty, the worst part. These acts weren't always committed by strangers. In many cases, the violence came from within. A neighbor, a rival, a kin. In a quiet corner of present-day Slovakia, archaeologists uncovered a haunting scene, one of the most brutal acts of prehistoric violence ever discovered. The site, known as Vrabel, revealed 3 Neolithic houses burned to the ground. Inside were the remains of 42 individuals, men, women, and children, some still lying in fetal positions, others sprawled as if trying to flee. Many were missing limbs, others had crushed skulls or punctured ribs, some had been decapitated. But what shocked scientists most was the context. These weren't casualties of an accidental fire. This was a deliberate massacre, a coordinated attack where an entire community was slaughtered and their homes set ablaze, possibly with the victims still inside. Carbon dating placed the event at around 5200 BCE, during the height of Neolithic settlement in the region. The people of Vrabel were peaceful farmers, growing wheat, tending animals, building homes. They lived in enclosed villages with ditches and wooden palisades, and yet they were not safe. DNA analysis revealed another disturbing detail. The victims were not all from the same family. Some shared close genetic ties, others were outsiders. There were infants and the elderly, indicating no one was spared. This wasn't a surgical strike, it was annihilation. But what triggered it? One possibility: conflict over territory or ideology. At this time, early farming cultures in Central Europe were competing for land and resources. Villages with different customs or beliefs may have seen one another as threats, and in the absence of law or diplomacy, the solution was fire and axe. Evidence suggests the attackers mutilated the dead, scattering bones and burning bodies beyond recognition. This wasn't just murder, it was meant to erase. A message to others: you do not belong here. The horror of Vrabel is mirrored in other ancient settlements. In Kyllada, Greece, a mass grave from the same era held dozens of skeletons, all buried hastily with signs of traumatic injuries. In Les Roques, France, a pile of bones showed similar signs: hacked limbs, bashed skulls, and burns. These weren't victims of disease. They were executed, and sometimes prehistoric death came not in war but in sacrifice. Take Çatalhöyük, one of the world's oldest cities in modern-day Turkey. Inside the densely packed mud brick homes, researchers found strange burial practices. Skeletons were buried under floors, within walls, or beneath beds. Some skulls were missing, replaced with clay masks or animal bones. In one case, a child's body was found headless, wrapped in textiles and placed in a ceremonial pit. This wasn't random. The Society of Çatalhöyük may have practiced ritual decapitation, removing skulls for ancestor worship or as part of religious rites. In some homes, multiple skulls were kept in niches decorated with ochre. Some skulls showed evidence of reburial, exhumed, painted, and reinterred again and again. We don't know if these acts were consensual or violent, but the emotional weight is the same. Prehistoric humans lived with death not as an occasional intruder, but as a constant ritualized presence. And what of the children? Across Europe and the Near East, child skeletons show signs of deliberate harm. In Lagarvelho, Portugal, the body of a 4-year-old child was buried with red ochre, but with limbs carefully arranged and the head turned unnaturally. In some cases, child burials outnumber those of adults, suggesting they were sacrificed during times of crisis, famine, drought, or epidemic. In prehistoric Carthage, hundreds of infant skeletons have been found in a single cemetery, many with cut marks on the bones or signs of fire exposure. While that site is later during early civilization, it reflects a chilling continuity. When times grew hard, the youngest often paid the price. The past is not a place of innocence. It is a graveyard of forgotten stories, of suffering buried in silence. And for every mass grave we find, there are 1,000 more that time has erased, even in the icy north. Among the reindeer-herding cultures of prehistoric Scandinavia, death left its mark. In Motala, Sweden, skulls were found mounted on wooden stakes, placed underwater in a prehistoric lake. Some still had sharp stone tools embedded in them. Others were pierced through the temples. There were no full bodies, only heads. Why? No one knows for sure. Was it a warning to others, a spiritual offering, or a dark celebration of victory? What unites all these stories, from Vrabel to Motala, from the Talheim pit to the mountaintops of Ötzi, is the depth of human intention. These were not accidents of nature. These were choices. People chose to kill, chose to destroy, chose to burn, decapitate, and dismember. And those choices echo across the millennia. In a world without police, without nations, without morality beyond the tribe, justice was often a weapon, and mercy a weakness. Beneath the searing sun of northern Sudan, along the banks of the Nile, lies one of the oldest mass graves ever discovered. At a place called Jebel Sahaba, archaeologists in the 1960s uncovered the remains of 61 individuals, men, women, and children, all victims of violence. The bones, dating back over 13,000 years, bore the unmistakable signs of prehistoric warfare. More than 40% of the individuals had embedded projectile points, flint arrows and spear tips lodged in their skulls. Spines and limbs, some skeletons had over a dozen wounds. One woman had 2 stone points in her pelvis, suggesting she was shot while trying to escape. A child had been struck multiple times, their tiny frame riddled with sharp-edged trauma. This wasn't a single event. It was a war radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy show that the burials at Jebel Sahaba span a period of several generations. These people weren't massacred in one battle. They lived in a time of chronic conflict where death could come at any moment, often in the most horrific ways. What caused such sustained violence? The most likely culprit? Climate change. During this period, the African Sahara was transforming. As the Ice Age ended, once lush regions began to dry. The Nile became a lifeline, a narrow green artery in an expanding desert. And every group of humans needed it to survive. Resources became scarce. Competition turned savage. Hunting territories overlapped. And when survival is on the line, cooperation breaks down. Jebel Sahaba tells a story not of one murder, but of generational trauma, a cycle of bloodshed that spanned lifetimes. And it's far from the only one. In Nataruk, Kenya, archaeologists unearthed the remains of 27 individuals, another prehistoric slaughter. This one dates back around 10,000 years. What makes Nataruk exceptional is the state of preservation. Many of the bodies were found where they fell, on their sides, on their backs, curled into fetal positions. Their skeletons tell a graphic tale. One man had his skull shattered by a blunt object. A woman, 8 months pregnant, had her hands and knees bound. Her unborn child never had a chance. A child's skeleton was found lying next to an adult female, perhaps a mother shielding her offspring in death. Here too, the attackers left the victims where they lay. There were no burials, no rituals, just slaughter, then silence. And the motivation? Likely the same: resources. Nataruk was once a fertile lakeshore. Its inhabitants were fisher-gatherers who lived in semi-permanent huts. They had pottery, tools, even jewelry. indications of wealth by prehistoric standards. And where there is wealth, there is motive. But the violence of prehistory wasn't always about survival. Sometimes it was about dominance. In the Santa Rita Mountains of Arizona, researchers found a cave containing the bones of 3 individuals. Their skulls had been crushed, their bones burned, broken, and scattered. But this wasn't just violence, it was symbolic violence. The placement of bones, the ritualistic arrangement of body parts, suggested not only killing, but humiliation after death. Similar practices are seen in skull cults across Neolithic Europe. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, human skulls were carved with grooves and holes, possibly to be suspended, displayed like trophies. Some were polished smooth, indicating long-term handling. These weren't funerary relics. They were statements, symbols of power, warning, or worship. And sometimes death came not from violence, but from unimaginable suffering. In Krapina, Croatia, the remains of over 800 Neanderthal bones were found, belonging to dozens of individuals. Some showed signs of disease, malnutrition, and even cannibalism. Cut marks on the bones suggested that the bodies were defleshed intentionally, possibly in times of starvation. Prehistoric Europe was cold, harsh, and unforgiving. When food ran out, humans turned on each other, not always in malice, but in desperation. These were deaths not driven by hate, but by hunger. In Gough's Cave, England, 15,000 years ago, humans butchered and consumed other humans. Skulls were cleaned, modified, and used as drinking vessels. The bones of children were cracked open for marrow. Some of these marks are so precise, they resemble modern butchery techniques, suggesting this was not chaos, but method. Even children weren't spared. One juvenile skull had clear evidence of scalping. Another had multiple knife cuts along the jaw, likely to remove muscle. These acts were intimate, personal, and terribly, terribly efficient. Today, we think of death as an ending. But in prehistory, it was often just the beginning of a ritual, a message, or a cycle. Whether on the battlefield, around the fire, or beneath the village floor, death in prehistory was never silent. It was a tool, a weapon, a stage. And through these bones, broken, burned, pierced, we hear the echoes of those forgotten voices. We often imagine prehistory as a simpler time, of peaceful tribes under open skies, living in harmony with nature. But the truth, buried in the dirt and stone, is far darker. For prehistoric humans, death was not rare. It was routine. And sometimes, it was chosen. The shattered skulls, scorched bones, and mutilated bodies remind us we were never innocent. Violence, fear, and ritual are part of our inheritance, carved into our DNA as deeply as cooperation and love. But these stories also whisper something more: survival. That even in the face of horror, our ancestors endured. They buried their dead, mourned their children, honored their fallen. They carried their grief forward so that we could be here. And now, we must ask, what will archaeologists read in our bones 10,000 years from now? What stories will we leave behind?